A woman went into the forest and stumbled upon dozens of tiny cars hidden in the grass. At first glance, it seemed like a strange find, but the truth she'd later discovered changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Maria's life had always been defined by quiet persistence. She lived in a modest brick house on the edge of a small town, where the streets wound lazily between old trees and the air carried the scent of pine and damp soil after every rainfall. At 40, she had learned to balance strength and gentleness, discipline and warmth. Every morning, she rose early, the alarm clock sounded long before the sun, and prepared breakfast for herself and her 10-year-old daughter, Lily. The girl would come into the kitchen rubbing her eyes, hair tousled, already clutching a book or a notebook because curiosity never left her even at the earliest hours. Maria would smile at her, push a steaming bowl of oatmeal toward her, and remind her to hurry, though deep down she cherished those slow mornings when they were alone together, before the world intruded with its demands. Maria worked as an elementary school teacher. Her classroom was filled with children's drawings pinned to the walls, the scent of chalk dust, and the low hum of voices that never quite disappeared, even in silence. She was known among her students as fair and patient, though she could be stern when the moment required. Many parents trusted her with their children's first steps into education because she gave more than just lessons in reading and arithmetic. She taught them discipline, kindness, and the importance of listening to one another. Yet, behind her calm authority there was always a hint of weariness. Being both teacher and mother, breadwinner and caretaker, carried a weight that no one else could quite see, though it pressed upon her shoulders each day. Her evenings followed a familiar rhythm. After finishing work at school, she would stop at the grocery store, collect Lily, and return home. Together they cooked dinner, sometimes simple soups, sometimes roasted chicken, always accompanied by laughter and the occasional quarrel about homework. After Lily was tucked into bed, Maria would sit at the small wooden table in the kitchen with a cup of tea, papers to grade, and silence surrounding her like a blanket. At times, she would pause, stare out the window towards the darkened forest that began only a short distance from her yard, and let her thoughts drift. The forest had always fascinated her. It was not untouched wilderness, but something older, almost protective, like a guardian presence watching over the town. She had walked its paths since her youth, and even now, as a mother and teacher, she found herself drawn to it as a place of refuge. The forest gave her what the town could not: solitude. She loved the crunch of leaves beneath her shoes, the filtered sunlight spilling through the branches, and the scent of resin and moss. It was here that she gathered wild herbs and berries, teaching Lily which ones could be eaten and which were better admired from afar. Sometimes she would carry a sketchbook, pausing on fallen logs or smooth stones to draw the crooked trunks or clusters of mushrooms sprouting after rain. The forest did not judge her, did not demand anything, and in its silence she found answers she could not hear in the noise of daily life. Her bond with Lily was strong, yet Maria often worried that she was not enough. She carried the guilt of being a single mother, though it was not of her choosing. Lily's father had left before the girl was old enough to remember him, leaving behind little more than a faded photograph and a silence Maria refused to fill with bitterness. She never spoke ill of him to her daughter, though in her heart she carried the memory of disappointment. Instead, she tried to give Lily double the love, double the guidance, and hoped that it would be enough to build a life without the absence weighing too heavily on her. Their evenings together, their shared jokes and whispered conversations before sleep, became treasures Maria guarded fiercely. Despite her worries, Lily thrived. She was bright, inquisitive, and full of energy. At school, she read beyond her grade level and often asked questions that surprised even Maria. Sometimes the girl would sit at the kitchen table, building small constructions out of cardboard and tape, pretending they were houses or cars, her imagination restless and bold. Watching her daughter reminded Maria of the resilience of children, of their ability to create entire worlds from scraps and dreams. Still, Maria feared the day Lily would see her mother's limits too clearly. That fear drove her to work harder, to ensure that their lives remained stable even when exhaustion whispered that she should rest. The town they lived in was not remarkable, yet it held its own quiet charm. There were old brick buildings downtown, a library that smelled of dust and leather, and a bakery where the scent of fresh bread spilled into the streets each morning. People knew each other by name, and while gossip traveled fast, so did kindness. Maria was respected, though she kept mostly to herself outside of school and the occasional church gathering. Her true sanctuary remained the forest. On weekends, when Lily visited friends or was busy with school projects, Maria would lace her boots, tie back her hair, and walk for hours beneath the canopy, letting the world fall away. One particular Saturday began much like the others. The sun rose pale and cool over the rooftops, and Maria packed a small bag with water, a sandwich, and her sketchbook. She told Lily she would be back by early afternoon, kissed her on the forehead, and set off down the familiar path that led into the woods. The first stretch of the trail was well known, worn smooth by countless feet, but as she walked further, the air grew quieter. The sound of distant cars faded, replaced by the rustle of branches and the occasional call of a bird. Maria breathed deeply, savoring the fresh air, and allowed her thoughts to drift. She considered her week at school, her daughter's growing independence, and the small repairs the house still needed. All of it felt far away here, softened by the whispering trees. That morning, she felt a restlessness she could not explain. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight filtered through the branches at a sharper angle, or the faint chill that hinted at the coming autumn. Instead of turning back at her usual point, she kept walking. Her boots pressed into ground that grew less familiar, the trail narrowing and twisting between undergrowth. She noticed how the moss thickened on the trunks, how the air smelled richer, more untouched. A part of her hesitated, knowing she should not stray too far, but another part urged her on. It was this decision, small and impulsive, that would alter everything. Maria walked deeper than she ever had before, each step carrying her into a part of the forest she had never explored. The silence around her seemed heavier, almost expectant, though she thought nothing of it then. She only felt curiosity, the same curiosity that had carried her through life's challenges and had now brought her here, to a place that seemed both familiar and new. She could not know that beyond the next turn of the path, something waited to be discovered, something that would connect her to the forgotten past of the town and to a story larger than her own. She adjusted the strap of her bag, looked around at the endless trees, and allowed herself a small smile. The forest had never failed her before, and she trusted it now. With steady steps, she moved forward, unaware that the ordinary life she had so carefully built was about to encounter something extraordinary, not in the realm of fantasy, but in the quiet persistence of history waiting to be remembered. Maria walked deeper into the forest, the narrow path twisting and bending until she was certain she had long left the well-trodden roots behind. The air seemed denser here, the trees taller and closer together, their branches interlacing so tightly that the sunlight was reduced to thin slivers of gold fallen across the moss. Her boots crunched softly against fallen leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig echoed as if amplified by the silence. She had always loved how the forest muted the noise of the world, but now the quiet carried something else, an anticipation she could not quite name. Her restlessness pushed her forward, and soon she realized she no longer recognized her surroundings. She paused for a moment, shifting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and considered turning back. Lily would be expecting her home by early afternoon, and she knew she could not risk wandering too far. But something in the air urged her to continue, as though the forest itself was leading her somewhere. She walked slowly, carefully, brushing aside ferns and branches until she noticed a sudden change in the terrain. Ahead of her, the trees parted, not in the gradual way they did near streams or meadows, but abruptly, as though a hidden hand had carved out a wide, open space. When she stepped through the last line of trees, Maria found herself standing at the edge of a clearing unlike any she had ever seen. The ground was strangely even, a flat surface surrounded on all sides by tall evergreens. Sunlight poured freely here, making the open space seem almost like an island in a sea of shadows. What struck her most, however, was not the clearing itself, but what lay scattered across it. At first, her eyes refused to make sense of the shapes. Small objects glimmered faintly under the sun, poking out from the grass and leaves. She moved closer, squinting, and then her breath caught. All across the clearing, as far as she could see, were tiny cars. They were the size of her hand, maybe a little larger, each one half buried in the earth or tangled in weeds. Some were tilted on their sides, their wheels broken or missing. Others stood upright, their forms oddly intact despite the passage of time. Maria blinked, unable to believe what she was seeing. She stepped cautiously into the clearing, crouching near one of the miniature vehicles. It was covered in moss, its once bright paint now chipped and faded, but the detail astonished her. The wheels were carefully carved, the body shaped with precision, and faint lines of paint still traced what had once been racing stripes along its sides. She reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against the cool surface, and the touch brought a sudden wave of curiosity. These were not the cheap plastic toys one could buy at a store. They were handmade, crafted with care and attention. The longer she looked, the more she realized how many there were. Dozens of small cars lay in clusters, some half hidden under vines, others arranged as though abandoned mid-game. It was as if time had stopped in this place, preserving a forgotten scene from long ago. Maria straightened slowly, her eyes sweeping across the clearing. There was something haunting about it, the way these tiny vehicles lay in silence, the remnants of hands that had once set them in motion. She imagined children running through the clearing, laughing and shouting, bending low to race the cars across the dirt. The vision seemed so vivid that, for a moment, she almost expected to hear their voices echoing from the trees. She walked deeper into the clearing, her steps deliberate and careful, as if afraid to disturb the strange display. She noticed how some of the cars were newer than others. A few still had bright colors, patches of red and blue that stood out against the brown soil. Their doors were slightly open, revealing tiny interiors that seemed too detailed to be mere toys. The craftsmanship impressed her. Someone had poured hours of work into these creations. Maria knelt again beside one that looked different from the rest. Its body was sleek, painted black, and though weathered, it seemed more recent, less consumed by the forest. She brushed off the dirt and found that the wheels still turned faintly, creaking as though they had not moved in years. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it into her hands, the weight surprising her. It was heavier than she had expected, its frame built of metal rather than plastic or wood. She turned it over, inspecting the underside, and noticed faint wires that had rusted but not entirely disappeared. A small spark of recognition stirred in her mind. This had not been a simple child's toy. For a long while she stood there, holding the little car, her thoughts racing. Who had left them here? Why so many? And why in this secluded place where no one seemed to come anymore? The clearing carried the feeling of something deliberately abandoned, as though once it had been full of life and then suddenly forgotten. The absence of footprints, the silence of birds overhead, only deepened the mystery. She felt a shiver of unease run down her spine, but it was not fear. It was the heavy, almost sacred sense of stumbling upon something left behind, something that belonged to another time. Her gaze wandered to the edge of the clearing, where more cars sat half buried under a pile of leaves. Some seemed positioned in rows like racers at the start of a track. Others were overturned, their frames twisted as though frozen mid-crash. The image was uncanny, like a moment of play suspended forever. Maria slowly lowered the black car back to the ground. She did not want to damage it or disturb the careful arrangement of the others, yet she could not walk away, not yet. She circled the clearing, taking in every detail. The ground itself seemed worn smooth in the center, as if countless feet had once trampled it flat. Around the edges, where the forest encroached, grass and weeds crept back in, reclaiming the space inch by inch. Nature was swallowing what humans had once left here, but the cars resisted, small fragments of memory refusing to disappear. Her heart pounded faster as she realized the significance of what she had found. This was not a child's forgotten toy left in the dirt. This was a collection, an entire field of them, each one a piece of history, though she did not yet know whose or why. For the first time since stepping into the clearing, Maria thought of her daughter. Lily would marvel at this sight, her sharp eyes immediately catching every detail, her imagination spinning stories about who had made the cars and how they had arrived here. Maria smiled faintly at the thought, though it quickly faded as questions crowded her mind. She reached for her bag and took out her water bottle, sipping as she gazed across the clearing once more. The silence pressed in around her. No birds sang, no insects hummed. Only the faint rustle of leaves stirred in the breeze. It was as if the forest held its breath, watching her discover what had been hidden all these years. She felt like an intruder, yet also a witness. Time passed without her realizing it. The sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the ground. Maria knew she should turn back soon, yet she could not bring herself to leave. Something about this place demanded more than a passing glance. She crouched again, picking up a second car, this one with faded blue paint and a number painted on the hood. The paint was cracked, but she could still make out the outline of a hand-drawn EA7. She traced it with her finger, imagining a child carefully painting the number, proud of their creation. The intimacy of that thought struck her, and she felt an ache in her chest. Finally, reluctantly, Maria rose to her feet. She glanced around one last time, her eyes taking in the strange little army of cars spread across the clearing. The discovery had unsettled her in a way she could not explain, not because it frightened her, but because it felt heavy with meaning. She could not yet see what that meaning was, but she knew she would return. She had to. As she stepped back toward the edge of the forest, she paused and looked over her shoulder. The clearing seemed almost unreal now, bathed in the late afternoon light. The cars glimmered faintly, their shapes blending with the grass as though they belonged here as much as the trees. Maria took a deep breath, steadying herself, and began the long walk home. She did not know that this simple discovery was only the beginning. Ahead of her lay answers, memories, and connections that would reach far beyond her own life. But for now, all she carried was the image of those tiny cars, silent and waiting, like a secret calling her back. The image of the clearing and its silent guardians followed Maria all the way home. She could not shake the sight of those miniature cars lying in the grass like forgotten treasures. Even as she pushed open the front door and heard Lily's cheerful voice calling from the kitchen, her mind lingered on the flat, sunlit space deep in the forest where time seemed to have stopped. She answered her daughter, smiled, cooked supper, and asked about homework. But the memory remained just beneath the surface, tugging at her thoughts like a hidden current. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep with a book still open across her chest, Maria sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in her hand. She turned the handle of the cup absently, staring at the wooden surface as if the clearing might reappear in the grain of the wood. She had told herself she would leave the discovery behind, but her curiosity would not allow it. She replayed the details again and again. The cracked paint, the hand-painted number 7, the sleek black car with rusted wires beneath. She had seen many toys in her life, both as a mother and as a teacher, but never anything like these. They were not simple objects for play. They were pieces of something more deliberate, something that carried a weight of purpose. By the time she went to bed, she had already decided she would return. The forest had offered her something unusual, and she knew instinctively that turning her back on it would gnaw at her until she gave in. Sleep came slowly, filled with half-dreams of children running across a clearing, their laughter dissolving into silence as they vanished among the trees. The following Saturday, Maria rose earlier than usual. Lily was spending the day at a friend's house, and the opportunity for solitude was too perfect to ignore. She packed her bag with water, a sandwich, gloves, and a small cloth, though she could not quite explain why she brought them. Perhaps she already knew she would not return empty-handed. With steady steps, she retraced her route into the forest, past the familiar trails and deeper into the wild. The clearing looked different in the morning light, though no less striking. Sunlight poured across the flat ground, making the metal and faded paint of the little cars glimmer faintly. Maria stood at the edge, letting the sight wash over her. It was not shock this time, but a solemn recognition, as though she had come to visit an old monument. Slowly, she walked forward, careful not to step directly on the objects, weaving her way between them until she reached the center. She crouched beside one of the cars she had noticed before, a red one whose paint had chipped away in flakes. With her gloved hand, she brushed the dirt from its surface, revealing faint patterns beneath the grime. It was astonishingly detailed, with a grille carved into the front and even the outline of door handles etched along its sides. This was no mass-produced toy. Someone had worked carefully, deliberately, shaping each feature. Maria lifted it gently, feeling its weight. It was heavier than wood, yet not quite as dense as full metal. She turned it over, studying the base. The axles were simple but functional, and though the wheels had stiffened with rust, she could tell they had once turned smoothly. She imagined a small pair of hands setting it on the dirt, giving it a push, watching it race forward. That image struck her with a sudden intensity. These objects were not just artifacts, they were pieces of memory, fragments of someone's childhood, perhaps even a whole community's pastime. As she examined more cars, she began to notice patterns. Some bore hand-painted numbers, while others carried stripes or shapes along their sides. Each one was unique, carrying the mark of its creator's imagination. One was painted in faded blue with a crooked lightning bolt along the hood. Another, though almost swallowed by moss, revealed careful grooves carved into the sides to mimic air vents. Even the smallest details spoke of pride and effort. The longer she stayed, the more the clearing began to feel alive. She could almost see the children kneeling in the dirt, lining up their creations, arguing over whose car was the fastest. She pictured them cheering as their little vehicles clattered across the flattened earth, the sound echoing into the trees. The stillness of the present moment seemed to hum with these echoes, as if the forest itself remembered. Maria carefully selected one of the cars to take with her. She chose the blue one with the lightning bolt, its paint barely clinging to the wood beneath. She wrapped it in the cloth she had brought and placed it in her bag, her hands lingering for a moment as though apologizing to the clearing for taking something away. She promised herself she would treat it with respect, not as a toy, but as a relic. On her walk back, the weight of the little car in her bag seemed symbolic. She was carrying more than just an object. She was carrying a fragment of history, even if she did not yet know whose. By the time she reached the edge of town, she had resolved to show it to Lily. The girl's sharp eyes and vivid imagination would surely see what Maria could not. Perhaps together they could uncover its story. That evening, as the house grew quiet and the light softened, Maria placed the car on the kitchen table. Lily leaned over it with wide eyes, running her small fingers carefully along its chipped surface. She asked questions in rapid succession. Who made it? How old it was? Why it had been left in the forest? Maria had no answers, but she felt an unexpected comfort in admitting that. The car was a mystery, but it was one they could explore together. For the first time since discovering the clearing, Maria felt less burdened by the questions. Instead, she felt the stirrings of purpose. She had stumbled upon something that mattered, something forgotten yet significant, and though she could not yet see where it would lead, she knew she had taken the first step simply by looking closer, by refusing to let it fade into the earth unnoticed. As the night deepened and Lily drifted off to sleep, Maria stood by the window with the small car resting in her palm. The moonlight traced its edges, casting long shadows across the room. She thought of the clearing once more, of the rows of tiny vehicles waiting in silence, and she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. This was not the end of her discovery. It was only the beginning. The little blue car with the faded lightning bolt did not leave Maria's kitchen table for several days. It sat there like a quiet guest, waiting to be acknowledged, while she went about her daily routine. Each morning, as she prepared breakfast, she would glance at it and feel a pull, a need to understand the story behind it. At school, while she stood in front of her students, her mind drifted back to the clearing, to the silent congregation of miniature vehicles resting beneath the trees. Even as she graded papers in the evening, her eyes would stray to the object that seemed to demand answers. Lily, of course, was fascinated. Every evening she asked questions, and when no answers came, she made up her own. She imagined a secret club of children who had hidden the cars, or perhaps an old craftsman who had built them and lost them in the forest. Maria smiled at her daughter's creativity, but inside she felt the weight of responsibility. This was more than a child's curiosity. There was history here, waiting to be remembered, and she could not ignore it any longer. The following weekend, she decided to take action. After dropping Lily at a friend's birthday party, Maria walked into town, her steps purposeful, though she did not yet know exactly where to begin. The first place she went was the library. The building stood with its brick facade and tall windows, smelling faintly of dust and paper as she pushed open the heavy door. She had always loved libraries, their promise of hidden knowledge, and now she hoped one might hold the key to her mystery. She approached the elderly librarian, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes who had known Maria since childhood. Maria showed her the small car, careful not to set it directly on the desk but holding it in her palms like something fragile. The librarian peered at it for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. She said she did not recognize it, but she thought it looked like the sort of craft work people used to make in the 70s when hobbies and clubs were popular in town. She suggested Maria look through the old local newspapers stored on microfilm. For hours, Maria sat at a machine in the back of the library, scrolling through the faded pages from decades past. She found stories about local fairs, school events, and the closing of the town's old factory, but what caught her attention was a small article from 1974. The headline was modest, almost hidden among advertisements, but it read, "Engineer starts model car club for local children." The article described a man named James Whitaker, a mechanical engineer from the factory who had begun teaching children how to build small cars from wood, metal scraps, and simple motors. They met after school in the town's community center, and once the cars were finished, they would hold races out in the forest. On a clearing, they flattened together with rakes and shovels. Maria leaned back in her chair, her heart beating faster. The details fit perfectly. The craftsmanship, the clearing, the rows of little cars lined up as though waiting for a race. She scrolled further, finding a photograph of James standing beside a group of children, each holding a small car. Though the image was grainy, she could make out the pride on their faces. It was not just play. It was a project that had given them purpose. She returned the reels to the librarian and thanked her. The woman smiled knowingly, as if she had expected Maria to find something worth chasing. On the walk home, Maria thought about the engineer and his club. She imagined the children, decades older now, scattered across different lives, perhaps still remembering their afternoons in the forest. Did they know their creations still waited in silence beneath the trees? In the following days, Marie began asking quietly around town. She spoke with an elderly neighbor who remembered hearing about the club but never saw it herself. She asked one of the older teachers at school, who recalled that a few of her students had once been members, though she could not remember names. Slowly, fragments of the past began to surface, like pieces of a puzzle. She learned that James had left town after the factory downsized, that the community center where the club once met had been repurposed, and that the races in the forest had ended suddenly, leaving the cars behind. The more she discovered, the more the story grew alive in her imagination. She pictured James as a kind man with grease-stained hands, patiently guiding children through the delicate work of sanding wood, attaching wheels, painting stripes. She pictured the children bent over their creations, proud of every crooked line, their laughter filling the clearing as they raced them. She thought of how time had swept it all away, burying the cars in dirt and moss until she stumbled upon them like relics from another era. One evening, while walking home from the grocery store, Maria stopped in front of the old factory building. Its windows were broken, and weeds grew through the cracked pavement. She stood there for a long time, imagining James and the men who had worked inside, building machines that supported the town. Perhaps the skills he used to guide the children had come from this very place. The thought filled her with both sadness and admiration. She wished she could have met him, asked him why he had chosen to pour his time into the children of the town. At home, she shared what she had found with Lily. The girl listened intently, her eyes wide as Maria described the article and the photograph. Lily seemed enchanted by the idea that children once gathered in the same forest, creating cars that still existed. She asked if they could find the people who had built them, if they might want to see their old toys again. Maria had wondered the same thing herself. The next weekend, Maria returned to the clearing. She stood once more at its edge, the weight of the story now pressing upon her. No longer did she see just scattered objects. She saw the remnants of a community, of afternoons filled with shared joy. She knelt beside one of the cars, gently brushing away the dirt from its surface, and whispered to herself that she would not let this be forgotten. She would bring the story back to the people it belonged to. As she left the clearing, she felt a strange certainty settle over her. She was no longer just a curious hiker who had stumbled upon a mystery. She had become a witness to something larger, a custodian of memory. The traces of the past had revealed themselves to her, and now it was her duty to piece them together, to give them life once more. The discoveries Maria had made in the library and through the townspeople would not let her rest. The photograph of James Whitaker and his little circle of children haunted her thoughts like a faded memory she herself had lived, though she had not even been born when the picture was taken. The clearing in the forest no longer seemed a mere curiosity, but a fragile archive of something deeply human, a piece of the town's heart that had been neglected and left to decay. Each time she remembered the rows of cars lying silent beneath the canopy of trees, she felt a stronger conviction that she could not leave them there to vanish into the soil. One quiet evening, after she had finished marking her students' assignments, Maria carried the blue car with the lightning bolt to Lily's room. The girl was sprawled across her bed, sketching animals in a notebook. Maria sat beside her and laid the little car down on the blanket. Lily's eyes brightened immediately, and she sat up, running her fingers across the cracked paint as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Maria told her about James, the engineer who had gathered children to build such cars, about the community that had once filled the clearing with life. Lily listened without interrupting, her mouth slightly open, as if she had just been handed a secret map to a forgotten treasure. When Maria suggested they clean and restore the car together, Lily practically leapt off the bed with excitement. They gathered brushes, cloth, a small box of paints left over from school projects, and spread newspaper across the kitchen table. Maria worked slowly, carefully, teaching her daughter to respect the object in front of them. Every stroke of the brush that swept away dirt revealed another detail. The fine grooves etched along the sides, the carefully shaped wheels, the faint trace of a lightning bolt once proudly painted. Under Lily's eager hands, the car began to transform from a forgotten relic into something vibrant again. As they worked, the kitchen filled with conversation. Lily imagined the children who had built the cars, inventing names for them and guessing what their lives might have been like. Maria, meanwhile, thought about how much patience and skill James must have poured into teaching them. She told her daughter that sometimes history lived not in textbooks, but in the quiet objects people left behind, objects that carried stories waiting to be retold. By the end of the evening, the car looked almost alive again. Its blue paint shone faintly under the lamp, the crooked lightning bolt repainted with a childlike steadiness that Lily insisted on doing herself. Maria felt a warmth spread through her chest as she watched her daughter's concentration. The way her tongue stuck out slightly when she painted, the pride in her eyes when she finished. It was more than just restoring an old toy. It was building a bridge between generations, a reminder that even the smallest things could connect people across time. The experience ignited something in both of them. The next Saturday, they returned to the clearing with gloves, brushes, and a small basket. Together, they chose several more cars, being careful not to disturb too many at once, and carried them home. Each car told its own story, revealed its own details as they cleaned them. The remnants of stripes, initials carved into the underside, traces of bright red, green, and yellow paint. Lily's laughter filled the house as she imagined races between them, calling them by the names she invented: Thunderbolt, Iron Wheels, Little Flame. Maria smiled but kept her focus on the precision of their work, determined to honor the craftsmanship of the children who had once held them. Soon, their kitchen table was no longer just a place for meals. It had become a workshop, a place where past and present intertwined. Evenings stretched into nights as Maria and Lily sat together, brushing, sanding, repainting, and admiring the tiny cars that slowly regained their dignity. With each restored piece, Maria felt she was giving something back, not only to the forgotten children who had built them, but also to her daughter, who was learning the value of memory, patience, and respect for what came before. At times, Maria wondered if she was being foolish, devoting so much time to these objects, yet the joy on Lily's face silenced every doubt. The girl's enthusiasm was boundless. She asked to bring one of the cars to school for show and tell, proudly explaining to her classmates how she and her mother were uncovering history from their very own town. The teacher later told Maria that the children had been captivated, peppering Lily with questions about the cars and where they came from. It was then Maria realized that this project was not only about restoring toys, it was about reviving a story that had the power to inspire even now. One rainy afternoon, as they sat together painting the stripes back onto a small red car, Maria felt an unexpected rush of emotion. She remembered her own childhood, the afternoons when she had played in the dirt with her cousins, building forts and racing sticks down streams. Life had grown heavier with age, filled with responsibilities and unending tasks, but here, with Lily, she felt a glimpse of that carefree joy again. The cars were not hers, yet they gave her something she had not realized she needed, a reminder that joy and creativity did not vanish with time, but could be rekindled through the simplest acts. As the collection on their table grew, Maria began to wonder what to do with them. She knew she could not keep them all hidden in her home. They belonged to more than just her and her daughter. They belonged to the community, to the children who had grown up and forgotten, to the memory of James and the work he had poured into the club. She wanted to share them, to bring the story into the light where others could see. Late one evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Maria stood in the kitchen, staring at the rows of small cars lined neatly on the table. Their colors glowed under the soft light, each one unique, each one carrying the weight of hands that had shaped them decades earlier. She whispered to herself that it was not enough to restore them. She had to return them to the people who once loved them, or at least to remind the town that they had existed. It was a promise she made silently, though she did not yet know how she would keep it. What she did know was that the project had changed her. It had brought her closer to her daughter, filling their evenings with shared purpose and laughter. It had given her a sense of mission beyond the walls of her classroom and her home. The clearing in the forest was no longer just a hidden place she had stumbled upon. It had become a thread connecting her to something larger, and she was determined to follow it wherever it led. As she turned off the light and walked toward her room, Maria glanced back at the cars one more time. They seemed to shine in the darkness, small but unyielding, survivors of time and neglect. For the first time in many years, she felt not only tiredness at the end of the day, but also a spark of anticipation. The story was no longer just about what she had found in the forest. It was about what she and Lily could do with it, how they could give the past a voice again. And that thought filled her with both responsibility and hope as she drifted to sleep, knowing that their work had only just begun. Maria's resolve to share the story of the cars with others grew stronger with each passing day. The collection on her kitchen table was no longer just a private project between her and Lily. It had become a testimony to something larger, something that demanded to be seen. The little cars had been silent too long, hidden under soil and moss, and now that they had been brought back to life, she felt compelled to give them their rightful place in the memory of the town. It was Lily who first suggested they tell people beyond their home. One evening, as she lined up the restored cars in a neat row and pretended to announce a race, she asked her mother why the children who once built them had never come back for them. Maria explained as best she could, telling her that life had carried those children away, that they had grown up and forgotten what they once made with their hands. Lily frowned, her small brow furrowed, and then said with determination that maybe those children, now adults, would want to remember. The simplicity of that thought struck Maria. She realized her daughter was right. Memory was not only a personal treasure, but something that could bring people together when it was shared. The next week, after long consideration, Maria wrote an article for the local newspaper. She sat at her kitchen table late into the night, choosing her words carefully. She described the day she had stumbled upon the clearing, the rows of cars left behind, and the story she had pieced together about James Whittaker and the club he had led in the 70s. She included a photograph Lily had taken of their restored blue car with the lightning bolt, its crooked stripe bright again under the light. She ended the article with a quiet invitation. If anyone remembered the cars, the club, or the races in the forest, she would love to hear their stories. The article was published a few days later, tucked into the community section of the paper. Maria did not expect much to come of it. She thought perhaps a few people would read it, smile, and move on, but she underestimated the power of memory. Within a week, letters began arriving at her door. Some were handwritten on lined paper, others typed carefully, but all carried voices from the past. Men and women in their 50s and 60s wrote to her, thanking her for reminding them of a time they thought had been lost. They described afternoons spent sanding wood, painting stripes, racing cars across the clearing. One man said he still had the scar on his knee from falling during a race. Another recalled how James had encouraged him to pursue engineering, a path that became his career. Maria read each letter aloud to Lily, and together they marveled at the flood of memories. Soon, people began calling as well. An older woman from a nearby town explained that her brother had been a part of the club and that she remembered waiting for him while he worked on his car. A retired teacher recalled walking past the community center and hearing the laughter and excitement of children building together. The voices overlapped and wove into a tapestry of remembrance, and Maria realized that her article had opened a door. The story she thought had ended decades ago was still alive in the hearts of those who had lived it. The true turning point came when a group of former club members asked if they could meet her at the clearing. Maria agreed, and on a crisp Saturday morning, she led Lily and a handful of strangers down the familiar trail into the forest. At first, the walk was quiet, filled with anticipation, but when they stepped into the clearing, the silence broke. The men and women who had once been children gasped softly, their eyes filling with recognition. Some walked straight to the cars lying in the grass, kneeling as though greeting long-lost friends. One man lifted a small red car and whispered that it had been his, that he remembered painting it with his father's old brush. Another woman found a green car with her initials scratched faintly into the underside, and she covered her mouth with her hands, overcome with emotion. Maria stood back, watching them. She saw grown men with gray hair kneel like boys, their eyes shining as they ran their fingers across chipped paint and bent wheels. She saw women who had carried decades of life's burdens suddenly smile like children again. The clearing that had once seemed so silent now pulsed with voices and laughter, the echoes of the past mingling with the present. Lily held her mother's hand tightly, her eyes wide with wonder as she watched adults rediscover their childhood. Conversations flowed freely. They spoke of James, their mentor, recalling his patience and his insistence that every detail mattered. They laughed about the arguments over whose car was fastest, the joy of victory, and the good-natured teasing that followed losses. Some grew quiet as they admitted they had not thought about the cars in years, that life had carried them far away from the forest. But now the memories returned as vividly as if no time had passed. Before the day was over, the group agreed that something must be done to preserve this history. They did not want the cars to vanish again, forgotten beneath the trees. Ideas began to take shape. A small exhibit in the town, a display in the library, perhaps even a permanent space where the cars could be kept safe and shared with future generations. Maria listened, her heart swelling with pride. She had not done this alone. She had simply uncovered the traces, but it was the community that had breathed life into them again. When they finally left the clearing, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. Maria walked beside Lily, who skipped lightly, her face glowing with excitement. She could sense her daughter's joy in having witnessed something so meaningful. For Maria herself, the day had been transformative. She felt lighter, as though the burden of keeping the story had shifted from her shoulders to many. It was no longer her secret, it was theirs. That evening, as she prepared supper, Maria reflected on the power of what had happened. Objects as small and simple as handmade cars had brought people together across decades. They had turned strangers into companions, sadness into laughter, silence into conversation. She realized that memory, when shared, had the power to heal, to unite, to remind people of who they were and what they had built together. The project that began as a personal curiosity had grown into a movement of remembrance. When Lily asked her what would happen next, Maria told her that she did not know exactly, but that something beautiful had begun. She promised her daughter they would continue to work with the community, to restore more cars, to gather more stories. She said that the past was not just something to be studied in books, but something that lived in people's hearts, and that sometimes all it needed was a spark to awaken it. As Maria tucked Lily into bed that night, she looked once more at the little blue car with the lightning bolt, now resting proudly on the shelf in her daughter's room. It had been the beginning, the first piece to emerge from silence. Now it had become a symbol of unity, of the invisible threads that bound people together through time. Maria kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered that they had done something important, something that would not be forgotten, and as she turned off the light, she felt a calm certainty fill her. The story was no longer just hers to carry. It belonged to everyone now, and in that shared memory lay a strength she had not known she needed. The cars had found their voices again, not through noise or speed, but through the quiet power of union. The weeks that followed the gathering in the clearing felt different for Maria, as though the air of the town itself had shifted. What had once been a quiet, almost invisible place now pulsed with conversations, visits, and ideas that seemed to grow larger each day. The article in the newspaper had awakened something dormant, but the meeting in the forest had solidified it. The little cars were no longer curiosities lying abandoned under moss. They had become symbols, vessels of memory that carried with them laughter, friendship, and the spirit of a community rediscovered. Maria found herself busier than ever. After teaching, she came home to phone calls, letters, and sometimes unexpected visitors at her door, people who wanted to share stories or offer help. Some brought photographs of themselves as children standing proudly beside their handmade cars. Others carried old notebooks with sketches of designs they had once dreamed up, faded but still full of detail. A few even searched their attics and basements and turned up cars they had kept all these years, tucked away in boxes and forgotten until Maria's story stirred the dust from their memories. Each object added another piece to the mosaic, and Maria was astonished at how much history could live quietly in the corners of people's lives, waiting for someone to call it forth. Lily thrived in this new atmosphere. She loved answering the phone, sitting beside her mother as they listened to voices full of nostalgia, or watching as guests laid out old keepsakes on their table. The girl became something of a hostess, offering tea, asking questions with the sharp curiosity of youth. Many of the adults smiled at her enthusiasm, remarking how much she reminded them of themselves when they were young, full of energy and imagination. Maria watched her daughter with pride, grateful that Lily was growing up not only with stories from books, but also with the living presence of history unfolding in their home. It was during one of these visits that the idea of a permanent museum first arose. A man named Peter, who had been one of James's earliest pupils, leaned over the table where the restored cars lay and said that they deserved a proper home, somewhere safe where future generations could see them. Others quickly agreed, their voices overlapping with excitement. Some suggested a display in the library. Others spoke of a small exhibit in the town hall. But as the discussion grew, Maria realized that the forest itself could not be forgotten. The clearing was the heart of it all, the place where the cars had raced, where children had gathered, where she herself had stumbled upon the silence that had begun everything. It was there, she thought, that the memory should be honored. In the following months, with the help of the townspeople, plans began to take shape. Volunteers cleared the brush around the old site, carefully preserving the cars that still lay in the grass while cataloging each one. Wooden stands were built along the edges of the clearing, and protective glass cases were ordered from a nearby city. Some of the former club members offered to share their skills, repairing and reinforcing the frames of the most fragile cars so they could be displayed without crumbling. Slowly, the abandoned place transformed. Where once there had been silence and neglect, now there was activity, laughter, and the sound of hammers and saws as people worked side by side. Maria was astonished by the way the project drew people together. Families came on weekends to help, children playing near the trees while their parents sanded benches or painted signs. Elderly residents arrived with stories and encouragement, their eyes misting over as they watched the progress. Even those who had no direct connection to the club found themselves drawn to the effort, eager to be part of something that celebrated the town's past. The clearing became not just a memorial for the cars, but a living space of community, a place where the present and the past intertwined. On the day of the opening, the clearing looked transformed. A wooden arch marked the entrance, with a simple sign that read "The Little Car Museum." Beneath it, paths of smooth gravel wound between the display cases, each one holding a restored car with a plaque explaining its history. Some plaques bore the names of the original builders who had proudly identified their creations. Others carried only simple descriptions, yet even those nameless cars spoke volumes through their chipped paint and crooked wheels. Alongside the cars were photographs collected from the townspeople, smiling faces of children from the 70s, James standing tall among them, hands resting on their shoulders. The crowd that gathered that morning was larger than Maria had imagined. Families from the town, former members of the club, visitors from neighboring places, all came to see what had been built. Maria stood beside Lily at the entrance, her heart pounding as people began to walk through. She watched their reactions, gasps of recognition, tears of joy, laughter that rang across the clearing. Children tugged at their parents' hands, asking if they too could build cars like these one day. Adults lingered in front of certain displays, lost in memory. The air was thick with emotion, but it was not heavy. It was alive, vibrant with connection. As the sun rose higher, speeches were given. Some of the former members spoke of James, honoring the man who had given them not only a pastime, but also a sense of purpose. They told stories of afternoons spent sanding wood and painting stripes, of James's patience and encouragement. One man recalled how James had once told him that building something with your hands was building something inside yourself as well, and that those words had stayed with him all his life. The crowd fell silent at those words, and Maria felt a lump in her throat. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated, unused to standing before so many. But as she looked out at the faces, she saw Lily smiling at her, and strength flowed through her. She told them how she had stumbled upon the clearing by chance, how the cars had spoken to her even in their silence, and how she and her daughter had begun to restore them one by one. She said she had not done this alone, that it was the community's story, and that she was grateful to have been a part of its return. Her voice wavered at times, but when she finished, the applause that rose up around her was warm and sincere. In the weeks and months that followed, the clearing became a place of pilgrimage. School groups visited, teachers using the story of the cars to show children the value of creativity and perseverance. Families came on weekends, walking among the displays and telling their own children what it meant to build something by hand. Sometimes, when Maria visited with Lily, she saw children crouching in the dirt, building their own makeshift cars from sticks and stones, laughter echoing just as it must have decades before. The spirit of the club had returned, not as it once was, but in a new form, alive and growing. For Maria personally, the transformation was profound. She no longer felt the quiet guilt of being just a mother and a teacher trying to hold her small world together. She felt instead like part of something enduring, a custodian of memory who had helped connect past and present. The little cars had given her more than she had ever expected: purpose, community, and a deeper bond with her daughter. And in the faces of the people who came to the clearing, she saw not just nostalgia, but hope, a reminder that even small things could carry immense meaning. One evening, long after the opening, Maria and Lily returned to the clearing alone. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the cases where the cars gleamed softly. They walked hand in hand along the paths, pausing to look at the cars they had restored together. Lily leaned against her mother's side and whispered that she was glad they had found them, glad they had not left them in the forest to disappear. Maria kissed the top of her daughter's head and whispered back that sometimes life gave you discoveries not to keep, but to share. As they left the clearing, Maria turned for one last look. The little cars stood proudly in their cases, no longer forgotten, no longer silent. The clearing that had once been abandoned was now alive with memory and meaning, and Maria knew, with a certainty that filled her chest with warmth, that what began as a simple walk in the forest had become an adventure that had given both her and her daughter a story they would carry forever. The little cars had found a new life, not through speed or competition, but through remembrance, love, and the power of a community that had chosen to remember together. Don't miss what happens next. Hit subscribe now so you never lose a story like this one. Click on the screen to watch the next video and dive even deeper into the hidden stories we uncover. And if this tale caught you by surprise, share it with your friends. Let them discover it too.